Good morning, everybody. My name is Mandy Emery. I'm from the East of England NHS Collaborative Procurement Hub, and today I'll be talking you through social value under PPN 002. So just a little bit about the agenda, we'll go through what social value is, what it looks like in the outcomes in the model. We'll understand the model question and sort of what good looks like and how to respond to different kinds of competitions. We will have a short break in between, just there's a lot of content to digest, so a little 5-minute break just to go away and absorb and then come back for the rest of it. Before we get into social value, though, it is helpful to align on a few key procurement terms. I'm conscious that not everyone that's joining the session might be familiar with procurement. So you don't need to be a procurement expert to understand social value, but understanding this language will make the process much clearer. So these are some of the terms that you'll come across in the session, and if you do go on to apply for any bids, you'll see some of this language as well. So hopefully this just helps you understand where social fits in within the wider procurement process. And just to say, the slides will of course be shared, so if you don't get it now, don't worry, you will be able to see it on the slides once they've gone out. So just as I said, my name is Mandy Emery. These are my contact details. I do like people to connect with me on LinkedIn, so if you want to connect with me, please do feel free. I've the hub now for about 2 years doing this role, and I quite enjoy it. So hopefully coming away from the session, you'll come to love social value as much as I do. So what is social value? This is the question that's brought you all here today, and hopefully if I've done this properly, you'll walk away being able to answer this question a little bit better. So what is it? There's no single definition of social value, but if we had to describe it in one sentence, we'd say that social value is the wider benefit a contract can deliver to the local area beyond just the core service that's being purchased, and that's particularly when it comes to economic, social, and environmental improvements. But what does it really look like? So I'm going to start with a story. Outside of my day job, I run a small community group. Nothing fancy, just a few events throughout the year, some cleanup projects, we do some litter picking, build a bit of community cohesion. Outside of my day job, last year I received funding to deliver some activities for local children during the Easter break, and there were quite a few activities planned: an Easter egg hunt, a fairy garden alongside a trail, a sports day, just a few things for the children to enjoy. And as soon as the money hit my account, I thought, great, let's go. Jump onto a well-known China-based supplier and just buy what I could from there. But I stopped, and it got me thinking, what if I could do more with this money than just deliver the events? So I had a look around and look at the project. What was I aiming to achieve? How many of these items that I was looking to buy could I actually just repurpose or buy secondhand? I looked for local suppliers and came across a young person who was having difficulty finding work as they just felt uncomfortable in a traditional workplace. They were trying to earn some money making some clay dolls, so I commissioned some fairies from them for the fairy garden. Of course, single mum, she was just trying to build her small catering business. She runs it out of a sort of catering van. She goes around the estates doing sandwiches at lunchtime. So I got in contact with her and found that she was the perfect solution for the snacks provided on the sports day. Suddenly, this funding was going a lot further. A young unemployed person was making these dolls, and I just started realizing that you could do so much more with it. A single mum who benefited more from the order than me just buying these snacks at a multi-billion-pound company. This young person who ultimately got the confidence to start a business, and then the carbon impact of the project was massively reduced because apart from a small number of things that I couldn't find locally, much of it was repurposed or bought secondhand. At the time, I thought to myself, this is social value in action. So it's not just about what we buy, but what that spend does. The project was delivered, but the decisions I made meant that the project went on to deliver more. So if you take one thing away from today, I think it's your decisions can make a real difference to people and communities. Choosing to work with local suppliers, choosing to reuse rather than replace, taking the time to understand who will be affected by your contract, that's social value, and at the end of the day, that's priceless. So if you've ever engaged in public procurement, you'll know that it can be quite a complicated process with a lot of questions and evidence of how you'll deliver the goods or services under a contract. So social value can sometimes feel disconnected. You might think we're already delivering. Why do we need to include social value? So procurement teams don't include social value to create extra hoops, I can promise you that. We include it because in public procurement, public money is being spent, and ultimately the communities affected by these contracts deserve to benefit from them. So your job as a supplier is to evidence how you'll make that happen. And evidencing social value doesn't mean making substantial commitments that are difficult to deliver, but about making commitments that can be sustained and leave a legacy for years to come. So when we are looking at procurement, social value in procurement, when we're designing procurements, obviously a lot of it is mandated anyway, but we're really looking at how the contract can go on to benefit communities, how additional value can be delivered through those contracts. Social value is scored alongside your other section sponsors, and the final social commitments are agreed between yourselves and the contracting authority, apart from direct award contracts, which we'll come to later. So social value is not a new concept. It has actually been part of public procurement since the introduction of the Public Services or Social Value Act in 2012, which actually requires public bodies to consider how their spending can improve economic, social, and well-being. So in practice, this means thinking beyond cost and considering the wider impact that can have on communities. So if we go back to my example earlier, the money was the same, the spend, the decisions were different. So this really set the foundation for how we approach procurement today, and ensuring that public money is not just spent to deliver services, but to create those broader positive outcomes. Next, social value doesn't sit in a vacuum. So it is actually shaped by what the government is trying to achieve overall. The missions set those priorities. So if you're aware of the government's 5 missions, you'll be able to see them on the bottom of the screen there. These set out the priorities. They define what success looks like at a national level. Procurement is one of the biggest levers that the government has to deliver those priorities. So naturally, they flow down into how we design and evaluate contracts. Social value is really about how those big national ambitions show up in these individual contracts. So if you take note of the 5 missions at the bottom of the slide, because you will see them again in a little while. So the next step is to translate those priorities into something procurement teams can actually follow. And that brings us to the National Procurement Policy Statement. So if you're aware of the Procurement Act that came into place last year, you'll know that alongside that a National Procurement Policy Statement was also issued. And this is where things really start to become real for procurement. So the government published their 5 areas of focus to drive mission-based procurement, and with a view to delivering their ambitions. The National Procurement Policy Statement calls for contracting authorities to deliver social economic value, supporting those 5 missions. So that really does try and encourage organizations to work beyond, traditional boundaries and really just consider how their procurements can actually align with those priorities. So the mission sets the direction, and the NPPS, or the National Procurement Policy Statement, tells us how procurement should respond to that. It's effectively the golden thread between government's ambition and day-to-day procurement decisions. So it's not optional. Contracting authorities are expected to have regard to this statement. It influences how we design specifications, set evaluation criteria, and ultimately manage those contracts. But still doesn't tell us how to measure or score social value or what actually we need to be including. And this is why the PPN 002 or the social value model was developed. So this is the bit that directly affects you as suppliers. And this is the model that a lot of you will see when you're tendering for procurements. I'm aware there are some other models out there. You might see the Thomas model, legacy procurements, call-offs from old frameworks might still be using the previous social value model under 0620. But this is the model that we're using now, and this is what this webinar is on. So this is what your social value responses are being assessed against normally. So it's not just guidance, but it does shape how the questions you're asked and how you're scored. So the outcomes that are in the social value model tell you what you should be aiming to deliver. And then inside the social value model, there's also a model question. So as we mature with this model, we will start seeing the same question being asked, and that is to ultimately make it a bit easier for suppliers to be prepared and be able to respond to the questions in the same way. So ultimately, the score will depend on how credible and measurable your commitments are. And that's sort of the difference between a generic answer and a competitive one. So you'll see that strong answers normally have, they don't just set good intentions, they set out clear deliverable commitments, and those commitments will be expected to be delivered if you win the contract. So the next step is then understanding what those outcomes mean in practice and what good looks like. But just before that, there is one more driver for the social value in procurement, and that's the NHS Social Value Playbook. So from April, it became mandatory for NHS procurements to include 10% social value weighting. But the PPN wasn't originally designed for central government, so technically doesn't mandate NHS to use it. But the NHS has chosen to align with it, which means you'll see very similar expectations when bidding on NHS contracts. So whether you're bidding into central government or the NHS, the social value model is effectively the standard you'll be working to. So the NHS Social Value Playbook itself supports buyers in using social value in NHS procurements, and that just helps maintain that consistency across the board. So the social value model, before we get into each outcome, it's important to understand how the model actually works. So the model is built around outcomes and what the buyer is trying to achieve. So you're not being asked to talk generally about social value or how your organization improves the working practices of your staff, but you are actually being asked to deliver against specific outcomes. So at procurement stage, the procurement person working on the contract or working on the specification will take a look at that project and try and understand exactly which outcome would be most relevant, proportionate to the contract, and then also allow for that consideration of smaller organizations, ensure that they can also deliver even in their smaller capacities. So there are a total of 8 outcomes, and each of them align with a specific government mission. So when I said to take note of the missions in the earlier slide, you'll see them again. This is where you'll start seeing them now. So the government 5 missions on the left, and then the outcome that directly links with that mission on the right. So if you had to look at the social value model online, you would see that it's broken down into an outcome, which is the overall goal the buyer is trying to achieve. There's model award criteria, and that's what you're being assessed against. And then there's model sub-criteria, which outlines the specific areas or activities that support that outcome. And that is basically examples of how you might deliver the outcome. Alongside that, there's also the standard reporting metrics, and that's how delivery will be measured and reported. And this really does just try and keep it consistent. If you can see up front what the reporting metrics might look like, you'll be able to respond in such a way, and you'll also know what to expect. So there's no surprises at final contract award stage. So again, you're not being asked to talk generally about social value. You're being asked to respond to a specific criteria, and you'll need to show how you will deliver that in practice and demonstrate how that delivery will be measured. So now we'll break down each of the 8 outcomes And at the top there, you'll see it says outcome 1, fair work. So it's broken down into the outcomes, and then it's got the sub outcomes, I guess you could call them, the model assessment award criteria, and that's the 1A, 1B, 1C. So as you go through, you'll see them broken down into each individual outcome. So this outcome creates and retain high quality jobs as defined in Max 1B to D. So this outcome is about the jobs created or supported through the contract, and whether they are genuinely high quality. So in this outcome, buyers are looking for clear contract-specific commitments on how many roles will be created or retained, where they will be based, how they contribute to the local area. And it's not just about your overall workforce, but the people delivering the contract. So with social value, it does tend to focus on the contract workforce, but it is important to note that that's the baseline. It doesn't mean that you're excluding the rest of the workforce from benefiting from improvements. It just means that the contract workforce is the target. So strong responses for this kind of outcome would be set out defined roles, including apprenticeship opportunities where relevant. I know that's not possible for all organizations or sectors, but where relevant, you might include apprenticeship opportunities. You'd show how those roles meet fair work principles like stability, progression, and appropriate pay. So generic statements about being a good employer without details or any numbers would tend to score quite poorly in this section. So this outcome is most relevant for contracts that involve a significant on-the-ground workforce delivering the service, particularly if there's an opportunity to create new roles or obviously sustain existing ones. So it's commonly used in more labor-intensive contracts such as facilities management, perhaps, or construction, logistics, larger service contracts with a local footprint. It's less relevant for low touch or highly automated or consultancy based contracts where there's little direct employment linked to the delivery of the contract. So an example of this might be a supplier delivering facilities management services could commit to creating a defined number of new roles. They could be local roles to support delivery alongside retaining existing staff where possible. So it might include apprenticeship opportunities in areas like maintenance or cleaning services that have clear progression route into supervisor roles. And this just creates that stable contract-linked employment rather than relying on existing workforce arrangements. So 1B is fair working conditions, and this outcome really focuses on the day-to-day experience of the workforce delivering the contract. So buyers want to see that staff are listened to, treated fairly, working in a safe and supportive environment. And this includes how you gather feedback. So and it's not just about how you gather it, it's about how you act on it as well, and how you ensure that issues such as maybe bullying, well-being, working conditions are actively managed. A strong response on this might show clear processes for engagement and improvement, so not just policies in place, but how you actively implement them and embed them in the organization. And the key really is to demonstrate how these practices will apply specifically to the contract workforce rather than describing organization-wide approaches with no direct link. So if you remember, the key to social value is it's that additional benefit to the workforce as a result of the contract. So buyers will want to see that your workforce is listened to and that issues are identified and acted on, and that people that are working for you work in fair, safe, and supportive conditions. Again, it's not just say you have good policies, you really need to show how they are applied to the workforce. So this outcome is typically used where there's a defined contract workforce whose day-to-day working environment can be influenced by the contract. So you might see that that's more relevant in outsourced service contracts, operational delivery roles, and sectors where workforce conditions can vary. So that's roles like cleaning, security, care services, and possibly manufacturing. It may be less emphasized in contracts with minimal workforce involvement or where delivery is largely remote or digital. So an example of this might be a supplier delivering cleaning services across multiple sites. They could look to implement regular staff engagement surveys specific to the contract with clear processes for acting on feedback. So really with social value, you need to know the communities that you're working in. So it does become a bit difficult if you're employed in a certain area, but your head office is based somewhere a bit further afield. It is really important to understand the communities and the areas that you're serving before you look to apply for social value, if you obviously are aware of who you'll be serving at that time. So other examples, you could introduce monthly team meetings, anonymous reporting routes, and then visible actions taken in response to those issues like workload or safety concern. So that really just ensures those working conditions are actively monitored over time rather than relying solely on existing practices. So 1C is fair pay practices, and it's a bit self-explanatory, but it is about financial fairness and security for the workforce. So buyers for this outcome are looking for evidence that staff working on the contract are paid fairly, ideally above minimum legal requirements, so ideally living wage, and are supported through things like sick pay and caring responsibilities. So it includes transparency around pay gaps, perhaps, and actions to address them. Strong responses would often include pay levels, explain any enhancements beyond statutory requirements, and show how staff are protected from financial hardship. So vague statements about pay without actually evidencing or detailing anything will likely be unconvincing. But this outcome is more relevant to contracts where there's a risk of low pay or financial vulnerability within the workforce, or where labour costs form a significant part of the contract. So you'd see that commonly applied in sectors like social care, facilities management, hospitality, any other service-based industries like construction. So maybe less applicable in highly skilled professional services or consultancy contracts, where pay is already well above the minimum threshold, although it could still be included if appropriate, but obviously the procurement team would have to look at that up front. So an example of this might be a supplier delivering a catering services who could commit to paying all contract staff at or above the national living wage, alongside enhanced sick pay from day one of the absence. So if you were to quote, anything that's a statutory minimum, anything that's legally governed, that wouldn't be social value because that's the bare minimum, that's the expectation. But if you were able to evidence that it was enhanced, you'd be able to define that as social value. So you could also look to monitor pay gaps within the contract workforce and implement targeted actions where disparities are identified. And this really does ensure that the staff are financially supported, and it reduces that risk of in-work poverty linked to the contract. So 1D is in-work progression to help people to move into higher work by developing new skills. And this outcome focuses on how the contract supports staff to develop skills and move into higher paid or higher skilled roles over time. So buyers will want to see that the workforce is not static and that there are clear opportunities for progression. So this can include things like training, mentoring, career support, and pathways into roles where there are known skills shortages. So a strong response would set out a structured approach to development, linked to the contract, with clear examples of how staff will gain skills and progress. Simply stating that training is available and without explaining how it leads to progression is usually too weak in terms of social value. So this outcome is more relevant where there's a stable workforce, where opportunities for development um, exist over time. So it's often used in longer term contracts, operational services and sectors with known skill shortages, or career pathways, sort of like social care, construction, engineering, manufacturing. This outcome would be less relevant for short-term or one-off or highly specialized contracts where there's limited opportunity for progression within the scope of delivery. So, but an example would be a supplier delivering consultancy services. They could introduce a structured development program for staff working on the contract. That might include mentoring, coaching, and access to professional qualifications relevant to the services being delivered. So this could mean that junior consultants are supported to work towards chartership or special accreditations with progression pathways into more senior roles. The supplier could also provide targeted training in areas aligned to the contract, ensuring staff skills develop, and over time leading to that improved, increased responsibility and higher earning potential over time. So this creates a clear link between the contract and meaningful career progression, rather than just relying on general provision. So 1E is identifying and managing the risks of modern slavery. And this outcome is about managing real risk within your workforce and supply chain. So not just demonstrating compliance through statutory obligations like the Modern Slavery Act. So buyers are looking for clear evidence that you understand where modern slavery risks might lie in your supply chain or in your organization, and what practical steps you'll take to identify and address those risks. So strong responses will go beyond policies and show how controls are applied in practice. And that might include supply chain mapping, auditing, training your workforce on identifying modern slavery incidences, and providing those accessible reporting routes for workers. So even in lower risk sectors, you're still expected to demonstrate awareness and proportionate action. So we're aware that a lot of UK-based organisations probably don't have a very high risk of modern slavery, but if you've seen in the news recently, it does still happen in the UK. So it really is just about, having that awareness, even if it's not part of your social value. So this outcome is most relevant in contracts with complex or extended supply chains, where international sourcing or high-risk sectors might be involved. So high-risk sectors include manufacturing, construction, textiles, food production in some cases, and logistics. So it's also really important where subcontracting is likely or where labour is sourced through agencies. So where you might lose sight of the workforce, this becomes more important than ever. And if any of your services are outsourced to other countries, this might become relevant to your social value as well. So while it can be applied to all procurements, it's typically emphasized where there's a higher inherent risk based on geography, sector, workforce model, or so the region, and then applied proportionately in lower risk contracts. So there are some new regulations coming into force on the 17th of May called the NHS Procurement, Slavery and Human Trafficking Regulations. And they have included some guidance on how NHS procurements moving forward will manage medium and high risk contracts. And part of that is including this outcome in those medium and high risk procurements. So it might be that you see this more often, even if it doesn't look like your supply chain is at risk of modern slavery. You may need to start evidencing that you're taking steps to ensure that that remains the case. So outcome 2 is skills for growth, and this still ties into the government's first mission. So this one is learning and skills development opportunities relevant to the contract to address skills gaps. So this outcome is really about building the skills needed, not just to deliver the contract, but to support wider sector growth and address known skills gaps. So buyers are really looking for evidence that you understand the skills challenges relevant to your contract, and that you're contributing to developing those skills through meaningful activity. A strong response here might show a clear link between the contract and the training being delivered, whether that's through apprenticeships, formal training, or engagement with education providers. So for this one, it's not specifically about your workforce and in-work progression, but it is about actually addressing those skills gaps in the wider workforce as well. So generic commitments on this one to training without any clear connection to skills gaps, or measurable outputs tend to score less highly. So this outcome is most relevant to contracts where there's a clear link to skills development, workforce pipelines, or sector growth. So it is quite a unique one in terms of the skills shortage list, but you might see it in sectors like healthcare, construction, engineering, digital and technical services, but it is also relevant in longer term or operational contracts where there's that opportunity to invest in the workforce development. It may be less applicable in short-term or highly specialized contracts, where there's limited opportunity to deliver that training or skills development. An example in this case might be a supplier who's delivering engineering services who could identify local shortage of technical skills, and commit to provide training programs aligned to the contract. So where possible, apprenticeships, or putting a workforce through accredited qualifications. Where that's not possible, it might be engaging with local schools or colleges, delivering sessions, engaging with students on those roles. So offering work-based learning is also a good way to do this one, and that just ensures that those skills are developed, and that they're relevant to both the contract and the wider sector needs. So outcome 3 talks about resilient, innovative, and flexible supply chains. And this outcome is create a diverse supply chain to deliver the contract, including new businesses and entrepreneurs, startups, SMEs, VCSEs, and mutuals. So I have had to summarize some of these outcomes because they're very long on the actual model, but if you have a look at the model, it's the same sort of detail. So this outcome is about how you use your supply chain to create wider economic opportunity. So this is where buyers are really looking for evidence that you're not just delivering the contract in isolation, but you are actually creating opportunities for a diverse range of organizations. So that's particularly social, small, medium enterprises, voluntary sector, and then newer businesses. So those startups that are trying to gain traction in the sectors. A strong response might show how opportunities will be opened up to these groups, how suppliers will be engaged fairly and transparently, and how those relationships will be managed. So it's really about taking into account the differences in need for some of these organizations who might operate on much smaller levels, and just working with them to build their capability and then improve the diversity of your own supply chain. So simply stating that you work with SMEs is not enough. You'll need to actually demonstrate how this this contract will meaningfully create those opportunities. So if you think back to my own example, probably 70% of the funding that came through went to local small businesses. Obviously, we're talking much smaller scale than the contract you'd be working on, but it does show the point that if you're spending that money locally, it does benefit those local communities. And if you're building, if you're supporting those small organizations in the voluntary sector and startups, it really does just give everyone a bit of an opportunity to grow. So this outcome is probably more relevant where there's a supply chain or a subcontracting model, and that's probably more likely for larger or more complex contracts where delivery is not carried out by the prime supplier. So really you'd be looking at construction, facilities management, infrastructure, and large service contracts where there's scope to involve multiple suppliers. So that means it's probably less relevant in contracts delivered entirely in-house with no subcontracting, or in highly specialized procurements where there's a limited opportunity to diversify the supply chain. But even at that, you can still work with local organizations to deliver the contracts, even if you're a small organization yourself. So for this example, a supplier delivering a construction project could commit to allocating a percentage of subcontracting spend to SMEs and VCSEs, including advertising opportunities openly, and simplifying that procurement process to improve accessibility. So, working with local voluntary sector alliances to try and get the message out there about potential opportunities, or finding other ways to engage with smaller organizations to deliver part of their contract. Engagement events to connect with those local businesses, and provide support to help those small organizations bid for work. So really this is just about improving and diversifying your own supply chain. And this genuinely creates genuine opportunities then for a wider range of suppliers to participate. 3B is collaborate in co-design and delivery with communities and anchor partners. So along the similar lines of the previous outcome, this outcome is about how you engage with and involve communities in the delivery of the contract, rather than delivering services in isolation. So for this one, buyers are really looking for evidence that you understand the local context. So that's a really key part for this outcome, is understanding the local context, and that you're willing to work with local stakeholders. So that would be including community groups, charities, and other anchor institutions, to really just shape and improve that delivery. So, if you were building a skate park in a local playground, you'd really want to be seen to be engaging with those organizations locally, schools, engaging with the voluntary sector in the area to understand what the needs of the community are. And this is really where this outcome shines. So a strong response in this one would show how engagement will be meaningful and ongoing. So it's not just a one-off survey and then just get on with the job anyway. It's really about how that feedback will influence the decisions, and how those relationships will be built over time. So generic commitments to community engagement without those methods or purpose are not likely to be effective in this outcome. You're more likely to see this outcome selected in contracts where there is a direct impact on communities or service users, so like healthcare, local government, housing, infrastructure, place-based services, and then any sort of local construction, housing, like the playground example I gave you. So it's more commonly used where services are delivered locally, and there is that opportunity to engage with users or local stakeholders to improve outcomes. It may be less relevant in contracts where there's minimal community interaction, like back office services perhaps, or highly technical procurements, where there's no local delivery footprint. So an example here would be a supplier delivering community healthcare services who would work with local charities, schools, health organizations, to co-design elements of the service. So really just using engagement sessions and feedback to shape delivery. They could also support sort of like a community-led initiative, like a wellbeing program or a local outreach event. And that just ensures that the services reflect the local needs, and build trust within the community. So we move now on to outcome 4, which is to deliver additional environmental benefits in the performance of the contract, including working towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions and use of clean energy and green technology. So this outcome is about how the contract can actively reduce environmental impact and contribute to net zero, over and above meeting your minimum compliance requirements. So buyers are really looking for measurable commitments linked to how the contract will deliver reduced carbon emissions, or resource use, or where possible creating additional environmental benefits like biodiversity or green space. So you might have to prove a clear baseline, and then have defined reductions and the steps needed to achieve them. And that's often working in tandem with the supply chain. So generic statements about sustainability without measurable outputs or clear link to contract delivery are not likely to score well here. So this outcome is widely applicable to most contracts, but you would find it more relevant where there's an environmental impact from delivery. So perhaps in construction, facilities management or estates, transport, logistics, energy intensive services, possibly something where there's an excessive amount of packaging, where there's clear opportunities to reduce carbon waste and resource use. So you probably wouldn't see it in low impact contracts like consultancy or digital services, but this is changing. So obviously digital services are not impact free, and the use of data centers, AI, and the life cycle of IT equipment are all starting to have a much bigger carbon footprint and contribution to carbon emissions. So as a result, this outcome is being used increasingly. Um, and being applied to digital procurements as well. So you shouldn't assume that digital services have no environmental footprint. So do start to consider how you might reduce it if you are predominantly digital. Um, Saying that, this is one of the most misunderstood outcomes. So buyers often ask for carbon reduction plans or environmental policies at the pre-qualification stage of a tender. And sometimes if this is used as an outcome in social value, suppliers assume that this is about meeting their existing obligations. So to be super clear, this isn't an extension of your carbon reduction policy. Social value must deliver that additional benefit through the contract. So if your organization is already committed to reducing carbon as part of its overall business operations, that alone can't be counted as social value. So the expectation is that you go beyond business as usual and demonstrate what extra environmental benefit will be delivered specifically as a result of the contract. So an example is a supplier might already have a company-wide commitment to reduce emissions by switching to electric vehicles over time. So that would be considered business as usual. A strong social value response would go further. For example, committing to deploy electric vehicles specifically for this contract from day one, installing local charging infrastructure to support delivery, or working with local partners or subcontractors to transition parts of the supply chain to lower carbon alternatives. So if you think back to my example in the beginning, I had a look at the project and tried to understand which elements of the project I didn't have to buy from scratch, from new, which ones could be repurposed, what could be recycled, upcycled, and then a section of it was obviously less carbon intensive. And then working locally as well is always a good way to reduce your carbon because you're not relying on any freight or additional delivery that is quite carbon intensive. So this then creates that clear, measurable environmental benefit directly linked to the contract rather than relying on your existing organizational commitments. So next we move on to influencing staff, suppliers, customers and communities through the delivery of the contract to support climate and nature protection and improvement. And this outcome is about extending environmental impact beyond the direct delivery of the contract, and that's by influencing the behaviors of those involved. So for this one, we tend to look for evidence that you'll actively engage your staff, suppliers, customers or communities to support environmental objectives. So be it through training, having green champions, having environmental awareness courses delivered at your work, or just sort of more collaborative initiatives, so working with supply chains as well and trying to use your influence to change their behaviors as well. So strong responses in this outcome might show how this influence will be delivered in practice and how it links to the contract rather than relying on generic sustainability messaging. And the focus for this is really creating that meaningful behavior change, to go on to support the longer term environmental outcomes. It's probably more relevant in contracts where there's interaction with people or communities, or where behaviors can influence environmental impact. So perhaps facilities management, healthcare, education, transport, any community-facing services where there are those opportunities to promote sustainable behaviors. This is likely to be less relevant in contract where there's limited stakeholders, or where delivery is highly technical, possibly contained just to yourselves and the contract holder, although it can still be applied where there's that scope to influence staff or supply chain practices. So I think it's important to know that, sustainability is everyone's business. If you have a sustainability lead in your organization, it's great to have that, but really sustainability is everyone's business. So, proper recycling, if you want to start at a small level and work your way up, it's just about that awareness across the organization and in the community. So an example of this might be if a supplier delivering facilities management services could commit to running a structured engagement program with building users, for example, and staff to reduce energy and waste. So that might include regular awareness campaigns on energy use, like say clear guidance on recycling, training for on-site staff to identify and reduce inefficiencies, and then alongside this they could work with subcontractors to adopt more sustainable practices, possibly even run periodic workshops to share best practice. So the impact here would be measured through engagement hours, and supported by reductions in energy use and waste over time. Outcome 5 is to support the reduction in crime. And this one is a very unique outcome, but we'll talk through it anyway. So this one is about influencing staff, suppliers and customers and communities through the delivery of the contract to support the reduction in domestic abuse. And this outcome is really about recognizing that the workplace can play an important role in identifying and supporting individuals at risk of domestic abuse. So this is where buyers will be looking for evidence that you understand the risks within your organization, and what sort of training and support you have available. So if you have appropriate safeguards and support for any victims of domestic abuse, and even just raising awareness, of what it looks like. So strong responses for this one might show how awareness will be raised, how staff can seek help safely, and how managers are equipped to respond appropriately. So this would often be in partnership with specialist organizations. Generic policies without practical application or support mechanisms are not likely to be effective here. So this outcome, you'd probably see it more in roles where individuals might be more vulnerable. So lower paid positions, for example, shift work, isolated roles, insecure employment arrangements, those are all quite high risk areas for domestic abuse. So you might see this outcome in sectors like care services, possibly facilities management if it's sort of security staff overnight, retail, hospitality, potentially logistics, anywhere where staff may work long shifts, night shifts, work alone or in lower paid or less secure roles. It's likely less relevant in highly specialized or low interaction contracts, although it can still be applied if there is a defined workforce, and if there's the opportunity to provide support and awareness. So an example might be a supplier delivering cleaning and security services across multiple sites. They could implement a domestic abuse awareness program for all staff, and provide additional training for supervisors on how to recognize signs of abuse and respond appropriately. They could introduce clear and confidential reporting routes, example, provide access to external support services, and that might exist through partnerships with local charities, or even offering things like flexible shifts or paid leave for those affected. So like I said, more relevant for staff working night shifts, isolated roles, or on lower incomes, where that vulnerability might be higher. Outcome 6 is employment and training for those who face barriers to employment, and 6A talks about creating employment and training opportunities, particularly for those who face barriers to employment and or who are located in deprived areas. So this outcome is really about widening access to employment, and creating opportunities for people who may otherwise struggle to enter or progress in the workplace. So it's really just about thinking about the barriers that people face in certain groups, marginalized groups, what barriers they might face, and what steps you might take to address that through the contract. Um, so this might show up in sort of targeted recruitment, tailored training, and outreach to communities or organizations that support those groups, maybe like a tiered sort of workplace opportunities so that they can come in and see if they can cope, just providing that extra support to those cohorts. And then a strong response would show how you link between the contract and the opportunities being created, setting those defined cohorts and creating those realistic delivery plans. So really in the areas where you're delivering these services, you would probably go on to something like the Office for National Statistics and have a look at the area you're working in and just try to understand what barriers people are facing. Many RCPs will actually have their health and well-being plans, which outlines a lot of this anyway. So there is ways to get this data. So when you're looking at responding, you can actually look at which cohort you might be able to support in this outcome. But sort of generic commitments or, using the equality and inclusion policies, it's not going to be effective here. It's not going to be classed as social value because it already exists within your organization. So you'll see that this outcome is most relevant in contracts with a workforce element, where there's an opportunity to influence recruitment and training practices. So more common in sectors like construction, healthcare, and facilities management, and often apply to contracts linked to like regeneration, community services, or areas of high deprivation. It may be less relevant in highly specialized or short-term contracts though, because there's unlikely to be that opportunity to influence recruitment or deliver targeted training. Outcome 6 is to demonstrate action to increase the representation of disabled people in the workforce, and this is about actively improving access to employment for disabled people by removing barriers and creating genuinely inclusive opportunities. So buyers are looking for evidence that you understand the challenges faced by disabled people in your sector, and you're taking practical steps to address them. So that's right from recruitment all the way to retention and progression. So that would include accessible hiring practices, workplace adjustments, creating an environment where people can succeed and develop. So strong response might show targeted action and a clear link to that contract workforce, again, rather than relying on general equality statements or policies without evidence of delivery. 6C is about demonstrating action to identify and tackle inequality in employment skills and pay in the contract workforce. So these are quite similar, these outcomes in outcome 6, and this is about identifying where inequality exists within the workforce and taking practical steps to address it. So buyers will be looking for evidence that you understand where gaps may exist in your organization or in your sector, whether it be in recruitment or progression or pay, and that you have clear time-bound plan to improve this through the contract. And this includes creating fair access to opportunities to support progression for underrepresented groups and ensuring that transparency around pay and promotion. So really we're looking for that targeted action. That's, how do you support this cohort? And you might find this more relevant in a workforce where there's an opportunity to influence employment practices. So again, that's probably going to be larger or longer term contracts, so healthcare, construction, public services, possibly facilities management. So outcome 7 is creating a pipeline of opportunities for the contract workforce, reducing barriers to entry for underrepresented groups. And this outcome is about creating access to opportunities before someone enters the workforce, helping build a pipeline. So this is about focusing on future talent. So this is really about looking for evidence that you're actively removing barriers to entry by providing early engagement or training. And this would more be for young people and possibly underrepresented groups and includes things like apprenticeships or outreach activities that help individuals gain those skills and confidence. So if you imagine a local school's career fair, if you went to one of them and tried to sort of encourage students to consider your sector or your role for future opportunities, it would really just start creating that pipeline for future staff. And you really need to be able to evidence that clear pathway, so from the engagement through to employment. So not necessarily that you have to go on to employ them, but just where there's real skill shortages or sector shortages, it's about providing that awareness upfront and early to kind of encourage that pipeline. So you'll probably see that this is most relevant in contracts where there's an opportunity to support entry-level roles or future workforce development. So that's more likely sectors with skills shortages or high demand for new entrants. So 7B will really be looking at those outreach activities like school engagement, mentoring, career support, designed to suit the target audience. So in this one, buyers are really looking for evidence that you're engaging with potential future talent, particularly young people, to help them understand the opportunities available and then how to access them. So this one is actually just measured in the number of activities delivered as well. So you'd most likely see this again in contracts where there's a need to build a long-term workforce pipeline, particularly in sectors facing skill shortages or where early engagement can influence future engagement. So kind of organizations, sector like engineering, construction, healthcare, similar to the early outcome. And then the last outcome in the social value model is outcome 8. And this one is about supporting the health and well-being in the contract workforce, including physical and mental health. This directly impacts performance, retention, and overall outcomes. So buyers will be looking for evidence that you're taking a proactive approach to both physical and mental health, and that would be including providing access to support services, raising awareness, and addressing barriers to well-being. So a strong response for this might show how these initiatives will be applied in practice with clear examples and delivery plans. So again, generic well-being statements or policies without evidence are not likely to be effective here. So you might see that this is more relevant in a workforce where the roles might be physically demanding or high-pressured jobs, or where they're shift-based working. Obviously, that is a higher risk for poor well-being. And this would be most likely seen in sort of healthcare, facilities management, logistics, construction, and public services. So that's where workforce well-being can directly impact service delivery. So you might see a supplier delivering transport services could implement a well-being service, for example, to include regular health checks, access to occupational health, mental health awareness training for supervisors. So at this point, you might be feeling a bit overwhelmed, and it's common for suppliers to feel a bit out of their depths with social value, especially small organizations, sole traders, or the voluntary sector, who may feel that they don't have the scale or the resource to deliver social value commitments. The key point is that social value is not about the size of the commitments, it's about the credibility and the relevance. So you're not expected to hire large numbers of staff or create complex programs if that doesn't reflect your organization. But buyers are looking for a realistic proportion of commitments that you can actually deliver. So in many cases, a small, well thought out action that's linked to the contract that you can evidence will score far better than a large generic promise that can't be delivered. So the focus should always be on what's meaningful, achievable, and aligned to how you already operate. So if you're a sole trader, you might be able to offer mentoring to a student, an early career entrant, or placing a short placement or shadowing opportunity. If you're in the voluntary sector, you might partner with another organization to deliver training or offer support in their community. So it's really just about thinking about what you can achieve and then evidencing how you can achieve that. So the social value question. Really, to understand how to respond to social value is really understanding the question. And the first part of the question is setting the foundation for your entire response. So this is where you're being asked to provide a clear, structured delivery plan within a set word limit. So every sentence needs to add value. The focus here is on setting out the specific, measurable, and time-bound commitments that directly deliver the outcome identified by the buyer. So this is not about describing your organization or your general policies. This is about what you'll actively deliver through the contract and how. Um, the reference to a method statement and project plan means you need to explain what you will do and how it will be implemented over time. So it tends not to be a separate document. You tend to respond to the question in the tender, but you might have that on hand for yourselves just to reference for future opportunities. So where relevant, you're asked to provide a baseline for reporting, and that you'll just have to say how many roles will be working on the contract, and that just helps the buyer then understand who will be benefiting from the outcome. But overall, this question is asking you to be clear, focused, and delivery-led from the outset. So the next part of the question, this is just copy pasted from the question online, and it looks detailed, but essentially it's asking you to build a clear and credible delivery plan. So you need to set out a defined commitment, explain who will benefit, and how you will deliver it in practice. You'll need to include how it will be measured and how it will be managed over the life of the contract. So really the level of detail is there to ensure that your response goes beyond an idea and demonstrates something that can be delivered and monitored and improved over time. So the full social value model award criteria will sit within the social value model, but in practice you're just being asked to show how your commitment meets the criteria, who will benefit, how you will identify and reach your target cohort, how your approach will be tailored to their group, and how you will influence staff, suppliers, customers, or communities where relevant. So these are specific to the outcomes. So where you're not being asked to engage with stakeholders or co-design or select a target cohort, you won't need to do that for every outcome. It's only the ones where you're identifying barriers to target cohorts. So you should also outline any plans for transparency, how you'll show it's working, and any commitments you'll publish, and how you'll manage that performance. So really the project plan elements is about showing when your social value activity will start, how it will be delivered over time, and how you will assess whether it's been successful. So this will include the actions you'll take, the timescales, and how feedback will be gathered and used to improve. So you may also need to explain what tools or processes you will use to monitor delivery, any governance that's in place to ensure accountability. So if you have a social value champion, for example, and then which metrics will be used to measure success. So these typically align with the metrics in the model, so you won't have to make up your own. It'll just be about selecting the relevant metric from the model. So when you break down the question like this, it becomes a lot more manageable. It's not asking you to do anything really complicated. It's asking you for a clear commitment, a defined group of who will benefit, and a practical plan for delivery. So everything else in the question is there to make sure it's specific and credible, and capable of being delivered. So it's really just going above that general statement of intent. So what you're seeing here is not a full response. You will need to put a bit more detail in, but this is the sort of structure of a strong response. So a high scoring answer is not about writing more, it's about covering the key points clearly. So each section builds on the last, moving from a clear commitment to who benefits, how will you deliver it, how will you show it's working, and how you'll deliver it and when. So if you can structure your response in this way, you're much more likely to score well than trying to include everything in a single block of text. So obviously a full response would include more detail, but if you get the structure right, you're already in a strong position. So The difference between a strong and weak response is usually clarity rather than ambition. So you can have the most amazing social value response or idea in the world, but without that delivery plan or how you'll actually achieve it, it loses the value a little bit. So strong responses are specific, structured, and clearly linked to the contract, which makes it easy for the evaluator to understand what will be delivered and how it will be measured. Weaker responses tend to be vague, and describe general business activity or lack a clear plan for delivery and accountability. So just remember, it's not about offering the biggest or most impressive commitment, but really about presenting something that's realistic, measurable, and relevant. Um, so there are different ways to apply for tenders in public procurement. So we'll just quickly go through the different ways that social value could be applied at each stage. So at open competition stage, which is where a competition is open to all tenders or all bidders, you have enough information about the contract to provide clear and specific commitments. So this is where your social value response should be fully developed with defined beneficiaries, locations, and delivery plans. So you'll be able to see which trust or organization or local authority or whoever it is putting the tender out. You'll be able to see what area they're in, and you'll be able to sort of do your research on it and be able to apply. So buyers here are expecting that commitments are directly linked to how the contract will be delivered, again, rather than just those general organization plans. At framework stage, it gets a little bit more complicated because the buyer is setting the overall structure for how social value will be applied across future contracts. So really you're being able to commit to the type of social value you'll deliver and how you will approach it, but not to define every detail. Obviously with a framework, you don't know who will ultimately end up using a contract or how they will call off the contract. So, location, quantity, timing is not known at this time. So really with a framework, a strong response will set out a clear, credible commitment and delivery approach that can be adapted later. And it'll sort of remain relevant and achievable across those call of contracts. Um, at call off stage, so where there is further competition, you're not being asked to start again, but you're being asked to build on what you committed at framework stage. So the focus will shift from what you will do to how it will be delivered for a specific contract. And this is where you might, the buyer might refine this to a specific cohort, the quantity or the location, the timing of commitment you'd be able to tailor at this stage, and really just explain how it will meet the needs of the local context. So for this one, you would really see a strong response would show clear continuity with the framework submission, but adding that detail to make it practical and then obviously contract specific. In some frameworks, contracts can be awarded without further competition, and that means that you don't get another opportunity to refine your social value offer. So this kind of brings it to light why we need to have fairly detailed responses at framework stage as well, because if a supplier does go on to receive a direct award contract, they will not be able to refine that more closely. So in these cases, the commitments you make at framework stage will become the basis for delivery. So you might be able to confirm details like quantity and timing at point of award, but you're not starting again. So this makes it really important that your framework commitments are realistic, scalable, and can actually be delivered across a number of contracts. So just a quick, simple way to test your response is to ask whether the activity would happen anyway. If it's part of your normal business operations or something you are already committed to delivering, regardless of the contract, it's unlikely to be considered social value for evaluation purposes. And it's really just about remembering that social value is about the additional benefit created as a result of the contract. So that doesn't mean that you can't build on existing activity, but you need to be able to show what extra impact this contract enables, and how that impact is measurable, and then directly linked to that delivery. So if you imagine it, if you have the contract, does that activity exist? If it does exist, regardless of the contract, then it tends to be business as usual. But if the activity isn't enabled by that contract, then you can class that as your social value. So from bid to delivery, social value doesn't stop once the contract is awarded. It becomes part of how the contract is then delivered and managed. And for larger contracts, you will likely see social value as a key performance indicator. So the commitments you make in your bid are often written into the contract at that stage, and will be monitored over time. At the end of the day, social value is about improving people's lives and the communities they live in. So there's a few little pictures from the Easter event that I spoke about in the first slide. A little fairies there. You can see I've used an old pot for a fairy house, and bits of wood and the rest of it, and the catering from our local single mum. So while it's often measured through metrics and KPIs, the real impact is less visible. It's the opportunity created, it's the confidence built, it's the support given to those who might otherwise be overlooked. So the goal isn't just to score well, but to deliver something that genuinely makes a difference. Um, Final slide from me, and then you can all go, is just a few important links. And this is all about all the links that I've spoken about, all the policies and the model that I've spoken about in this session. At the bottom there, you'll see that we've launched our Demystifying Public Procurement series, and that just provides bite-sized videos on key procurement topics. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about procurement, that's a good way to get started. But just a huge thank you to everyone who attended today. I will be sending out the slides, and I will be sending out a survey link. If you could just complete that for me, just helps me understand if I have actually helped you here today. But if there's nothing else, then thank you everyone, and have a good afternoon.